Well, then, welcome everyone. We're very happy to be here this morning and present to you our toolkit for mainstreaming gender and climate finance, which is, as Selena said, something we've been working on for some time. Wait just a second. So we're going to briefly today present just an overview and a quick summary of our research. But the main part of what we want to do today is explain to you this toolkit that we've produced and why it might be useful to you, and illustrate with a couple of examples. But first of all, who are we? So we've been working with BASE now since around this time last year. We started a project through the Geneva Graduate Institute, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland. And we basically wanted to research gender gaps in climate financing mechanisms and create a toolkit that helps all actors within climate finance ecosystems address those gaps. And we've had some main findings that my colleague will now explain to you before we then get further into the toolkit itself. So I'll now pass on to Janet, who's my other student colleague, and then finally Dwansha will also be explaining the toolkit in a bit. Over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Jatin. You can also call me Janet. I'm glad to be here. So first of all, I will talk about why did we decide to focus on the climate finance and gender nexus. Our motivation is to solve the disproportionate impacts of climate change. As we all know that climate change disproportionately affects the global south, and not enough climate finance are flowing into the global south. And much in the same way, women are also disproportionately affected by climate change. However, gender has been overlooked in climate finance on both the international and local scale, with only 0.01% of climate finance projects directly addressing women's rights. And gender has rarely been considered throughout the entire project life cycles. So to tackle this challenge, we need to attain a larger impact of the climate finance available. And one way to softening and eventually breaking down such barriers is to mainstream gender in climate finance through the creation of toolkits and pragmatic how-to guides tools for practitioners to develop their own gender strategies in market-based approaches like your VCCA project. So the first part of our toolkit is the theoretical part of the gaps and recommendations of mainstream gender that we have gathered through interviews and research. And as you can see in this graph, that we divided the key players in the climate finance project ecosystem into 3 general categories: donors, project practitioners, and local stakeholders, which are beneficiaries, financial institutions, technology providers, and local government. So first of all, donors refer to financing channels like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Green Climate Fund, bilateral development cooperation agencies, and regional or national funds. And we found that common gaps in donors are like gender is considered an add-on element and has not been systematically integrated across the project life cycles. And also that gender indicators can be insufficient to map progress. And sometimes only quantitative indicators are being used, which risk making gender integration a box-ticking exercise. Second, project practitioners refers to teams responsible for all phases of a climate project, whether that be in planning, designing, implementing, or evaluating. And in this case, would be your team. And we have found that project practitioners are not usually specialized in gender. And even with the existence of gender experts, their roles are often limited to specific stages of the project lifecycle. And the teams might have gender imbalance inside with project management and decision-making. And practitioners tend to highly depend on indicators, which can be insufficient. And finally, gender is being overlooked in project planning and designing phase. And last, with local stakeholders, we found that generally a higher proportion of men work in local stakeholders. And the methods used to reach local stakeholders can be gender-biased. Women are also neglected as clients in financial system, and that gender gaps exist on the beneficiary side with women having less access to resources, facing domestic violence and time poverty. So as you can see, that project practitioners lie in the center of part of climate finance projects. They can leverage the whole ecosystem towards better gender integration through interacting with all actors. And that is why we develop these recommendations through the lens of project practitioners. So when interacting with donors, you should encourage fund level requirements on gender integration throughout the project. Through conducting analysis, collect gender disaggregated data, and provide enough resources and information. And while working within your own team, you should incorporate local gender specialists in every phase of the project to maintain a consistency between planning and implementation and evaluation. And you should also establish a common understanding of gender within the team to understand how you are doing with your gender integration and what's your goal. To understand that the gender integration is neither due diligence nor trendy, but it is more a good business sense. And you should also add qualitative and subjective components to gender measurements using subjective data and localized indicators. For example, one could measure whether women think their opinions have been heard instead of only measuring the number of women attendees in the meeting. And while collaborating with local stakeholders, we understand that you mostly work with local governments. So you should make an ally with local governments to increase public financing and political support of gender-sensitive climate projects by presenting them with qualitative and quantitative data from your project outcomes and identify your project in line with SDGs or other development objectives from the government and relate your project to government agencies. And one thing to keep in mind is to include beneficiaries in all project considerations. So to improve the inclusion of women in all stages of the project lifecycle, to support the voicing of opinions from all beneficiaries, to collect gender disaggregated data to understand your project outcomes and set in place effective grievance mechanisms, and most importantly, to ensure an inclusive working environment with policies, indicators, improving working conditions, and offering capacity building opportunities. So after introducing the theoretical part, we understand why mainstream gender in climate finance is important. Now we can move on to the practical parts, which we would provide you with tools and case studies to understand how and practice how to mainstream gender. And hopefully we can reach the impact of women empowerment, improve project performance, and eventually reach gender equality. So our toolkit provides you with the framework and the company ready-to-use resources for consideration when implementing new market-based approaches in climate finance. So our logic is to consider these tools as a math question. So first of all, you analyze your current situation of gender equation, and then you can set a goal of how you want to reach at the end of the project. And in order to achieve that goal, you use our tool to analyze your the existing gender barriers and to develop a gender action plan. So now I would hand over to my colleague to present you the specific 4 tools we have.
Good. Now we know that this is a lot of information for everyone, so bear with us. But as we now start with the first part of the toolkit, this is what we call a gender gap diagnostic tool, which is basically just a question sheet that tries to address and capture some of the current gender gaps you might have within your project. And this is important because only by finding or figuring out what those gaps might be is how you can get to setting yourself gender targets. Now we have a whole bunch of questions, but I think it's easier if we explain it by going through an example as well. We've divided these questions into the different project stages that your team goes through, which is starting with an initiation phase. That's just internally you discussing in your team what the next steps are going to be before you then head into a designing phase, an implementation phase, and the monitoring and evaluation stage. We've also divided this into different stakeholder groups so that it's going to be easier for you to locate where exactly you might have gaps within your dealings with local government, for example, or with financial institutions, donors, beneficiaries. So now we've shown an example here of what this question sheet could look like. And it's simple in the way that you answer yes or no. For example, in this initiation stage, which focuses mostly on you as a team on its own, one question could be, are 50%, at least 50% or more of the individuals working in the project team women? If that's not the case, then you simply put no, and then you move on to the next question. Another example now in the design phase could be in interacting with donors, is gender a thematic priority in your funding proposal? If that is the case, then you answer yes. Also in the designing phase, when you're interacting with local governments, two other questions could be, have you analyzed gender policies in the local context for possible synergies with your own project? Or have you identified gender focal points or champions at senior levels within local government? So this is basically helping you design the project towards more gender synergies within local government. And also in interacting with beneficiaries, still at the designing phase, it could be questions such as, have you specifically consulted women within beneficiary groups? Or have you made efforts to analyze your gender disaggregated data with an intersectional lens, that being, for example, across caste, age, and other such categories, more than just gender. In the implementation stage, questions could be, have you held a meeting with local government agencies and projects fitting the above criteria of knowledge sharing or your gender targets and outcomes? And this all seems maybe a little bit complicated at first, but just when you go through the questions, it will make more sense. And monitoring and evaluation, interacting with financial institutions, one question could be, if you've shared gender disaggregated data that you've collected from your project, if you've shared that data with financial institutions so that they may then use it to improve their future products. They're specific, these questions, but at the end, this then means that you get a final score, a percentage score that you can calculate of how many times you've answered yes in total. In this case, that's 29% of the questions that you ended up answering yes. And this becomes important when we turn to the next part of the toolkit, which is the gender target roadmap. And this right here is how you see where you're placed basically on the larger scale of where you want to set your gender targets. In this previous example, you had 29%, which means that you would be in level 1, gender unintentional. And don't be scared of the wording necessarily. It's just saying that right now we have 3 different levels. One is gender unintentional. This is where most projects probably lie. Level 2, where you're gender intentional, and level 3, where you're gender transformative. And by calculating your scores from the question sheet, you place yourself in these different categories. And at level 1, your project is only just starting to really consider how to learn and apply a gender lens. So everything is still kind of new to you. Whereas at the gender intentional level, the second level, you've embarked upon this journey and you know a little bit. You've started to consider gender maybe across all project stages instead of just perhaps implementation. And gender is starting to become less of a checkbox exercise, but something you incorporate more often. At level 3, this is where your gender transformative, it's more incorporated, and your project team is very knowledgeable about the possible gender gaps you face in the local context that your project is working in. And it's quite a natural thing for you to think about gender in all phases of your project. And this is why we also want to highlight that there's a conceptual ideal, which is gender has been mainstreamed, that you'll see on this graph. This is not something that you can attain actually within your own team or project 100%. This is just to highlight that if every single climate finance project out there, if every single project team is at the gender transformative level and naturally incorporates gender, well, then that entire effort for the ecosystem would mean that we could say that gender has been mainstreamed. But until that is just as natural to every team's work as for the gender transformative teams, well, then we can't say that gender has been mainstreamed. So this is just a motivating factor, the conceptual ideal that you can keep around. And just some very, very brief examples of what gaps can be in each of these different levels is at the level 1, perhaps. Your team is not properly trained on gender issues, not entirely, and you might not have considered gender in the initiation or designing stages of the project. At the second level, however, you might just struggle a little bit to understand all the different gender barriers that you face within all stakeholder groups involved in the project. It might also be that you've not consulted enough local gender experts. And at the final level, where you're gender transformative, your issues might be that you face some difficulties in setting and tracking accurate gender indicators or KPIs that truly measure the impact that your project has on women's lives. And with that said, we'll get further into the toolkit, and I'll pass over to Dwansha.
Hi everyone, my name is Dwansha. I'm happy to be here to present you the rest of our toolkit. So after understanding your current gender situation and setting your gender target, you need to figure out how to transform from the current situation to the gender target. We have developed 2 tools to help you to understand how. The first is a gender barrier analysis framework. Because gender barriers in the local context are very difficult to overcome in the short term, so it's very important for you to understand and to be aware of them during the entire project life cycle. So this framework consists of 7 different dimensions, including health, education, labor, power, finance, technology, and time. For each dimension, we have listed several indicators to help you to collect data to understand the gender barriers. For example, if you would like to understand gender barriers in technology, you can collect data regarding women's access to internet and women's access to communication tools, such as mobile phones. But the indicators listed here don't necessarily cover all the aspects. It's important for you to check and revise those indicators according to the local context. Next, I'm going to show an example using the framework to understand the gender barriers in India. So the data are collected from World Bank and the International Labour Organization. From the data, we can clearly see that there are significant gender gaps in terms of education, labor force participation, digital literacy, and time poverty. Especially in terms of labor and time, women in India have to share around 90% of the unpaid care work and have a much lower chance to enter the job market. It's crucial to take these barriers into account in all project phases, especially when designing your gender action plan. For example, at places where women have much lower gender literacy, it's not recommended to take digital approaches such as online survey, unless you put additional efforts to help women to access to it. Another example can be, since women are bearing the burden of unpaid domestic work, it's better to conduct a survey to understand their available time before having any outreach activities for potential beneficiaries. And the next tool is gender action recommendation sheet. So after understanding gender barriers in the local context, you'll need to design your own gender action plan. And this sheet will help you to do so. We have defined 8 gender dimensions here, including women employment, gender capacity building, women consultation, gender incentives for local stakeholders, gender inclusive working environment, gender responsive outsourcing, effort to reach female clients, and grievance mechanism. In each dimension, we have recommendations for each gender current level. For example, regarding women employment, which is the first dimension, if you are in gender level 1, which is gender unintentional, we have provided 2 recommendations. First is equal pay for equal work in the project team. Second is make sure women present more than 30% of the team. And if you are in gender level 2, which is gender intentional, we have a bit more progressive recommendations for you, such as make sure women present at least 50% of team, not just 30%. And also make sure women have equal opportunities for promotion in leadership positions. The last recommendation is encouraging stakeholders to provide on-job training to reduce barriers to participate in formal labor market for women who face limited access to education and training opportunities. And if you're already in gender level 3, which is gender transformative, we have even more progressive recommendations for you, such as make sure women present at least 50% of the leadership positions in your organization, and require stakeholders to provide on-job training for women, not just encourage stakeholders. So next is just like the details of the recommendation sheet. Because of time limit, I'm not going to explain it all. And the next will be an additional tool. Yes, this one. This is an additional tool to provide a linkage between question list in the first tool and the gender dimensions we have defined in the recommendation sheet. So gender dimensions linked to the questions you answered no are those key gender dimensions you need to give like extra attention. For example, if you answered no to question 7, it's recommended you pay extra efforts to gender capacity building, gender incentives for local stakeholders, and the gender inclusive working environment. Well, we are currently updating this table. You can define your own gender, like key gender dimensions with this table and use it to create a more detailed gender action plan. And next is an example of a gender action plan if your current gender level is gender unintentional. And please note all these recommendations from us are just like rather general, so it's better that you adjust them according to your local context and project. Now we have presented all the tools we created. So in this project, we have defined the climate finance project ecosystem, including many actors, and the key actor is a project practitioner. We found significant gender gaps existing in all project phases, including initiation, designing, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So to help project practitioners to overcome those gender barriers, we have developed a toolkit consisting of 4 tools: gender gap diagnostic tool, gender target roadmap, gender barriers analysis framework, and gender action recommendation sheet. These tools will help you to understand your gender current situation and the gender barriers in the local context, define your own gender target, and eventually create your own gender action plan. We hope this presentation has provided you with some insights on why you need to work on gender mainstreaming and how to achieve it in your own organization. Thank you very much for your attention.